We need to be prepared for extended dry periods and also be prepared for these really, really wet periods. I mean, because of the conveyance constriction that we have on the Friant Canal that we're trying to fix, in 2017, we couldn't move 300,000 acre feet of water that would have gone to groundwater storage in the San Joaquin Valley for use by farmers and communities. And that was a huge disaster.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we're joined by special guest Alexandra Biering. Alexandra, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I know. We've been excited to have you on. We've been, talking to a lot of people about water, and we love watching you on Twitter, talking a little water, a little other stuff, mostly other stuff, but sometimes water. So wanted to have you on the show and kind of find a little more about you and kind of what you're working on. So if you could give us a little background on yourself and how you kind of got to Sacramento and started working in politics.
Yeah, thank you. So I work for an organization called Friant Water Authority, and I'm based here in Sacramento, but the organization itself is down in the San Joaquin Valley. So I'm sort of remote because I'm the person in Sacramento, so to speak. I'm actually from Sacramento. I'm a Sacramento native, and I went to college. I didn't study anything related to water or natural resources. I studied philosophy, but I had a double major. Yep, I'm a philosophy major, and I'm gainfully employed. So don't worry if your kid ever grows up to be a philosophy major. So I ended up getting a double major in politics, came back, had nothing to do that summer, and I started working for the Schwarzenegger campaign in 2003. Had some friends that were doing that, and so I went down to LA for a while, came back up here, worked on the campaign. Then I was in the governor's office for about a year and a half, working as an assistant for the cabinet secretaries, and then also for his economic advisor, David Crane. So that, at some point, I decided I really wanted to have a little bit more targeted policy experience. And so I started asking some of his deputy cabinet secretaries for the opportunity to just write a memo on something random that they have a question about. And one of them came to me one day and said, we're getting these calls and letters from this tribe up in Northern California who are really upset about this plan that Senator Feinstein's been talking about related to raising Shasta Dam, because it's in their ancestral homeland and very sacred places to them. And can you just talk to them and figure out what's going on and what the issue is? And so I did. So I talked to the tribe, the Winnemem Wintu tribe, talked to some other folks at the state, at DWR and elsewhere, wrote a memo, and never thought I would be interested in water, but it just sort of lit a fire. So then I ended up at the Natural Resources Agency for a couple of years doing speechwriting, external affairs, communications. That was 2005, and politics in Sacramento was pretty toxic at the time. It felt like I never really wanted to read the newspaper anymore. So I wanted to get out of Sacramento and out of California. So I went to Duke. I got my master's degree in public policy there, really focused mostly on environmental policy, did my thesis for the Nicholas Institute of Environmental Studies and Policy, and then came back here and started working in a very technical, much more technical role in water at a consulting firm. So I was doing work for the Bureau of Reclamation on some dam raises, some climate change studies, did some flood work for DWR, just really wanted to come back and do California water. That was really all I wanted to do. When I got to North Carolina, DC wasn't as attractive to me as coming back to California. So I did. And then one of the things that I'd worked on for a while was this project called the San Joaquin River Restoration Program. So it was the culmination of a 18-year-long lawsuit and series of negotiations between the Bureau of Reclamation, the Friant Division, Central Valley Project water contractors, federal water contractors, and a group of environmental organizations, including NRDC and the Bay Institute and a few others. And it's an attempt to restore a salmon population to a stretch of the San Joaquin River below Friant Dam that has been dry for 70 years. So we're implementing that now. But I started working as a consultant on that and getting to know some of the Friant guys, the farmers there, and the managers. And then there was an opportunity where they were doing some, I would say, rebuilding at the leadership level within the organization. And so I was asked to come on as government affairs and communications manager, and that was in 2016. So the Friant Water Authority is a joint powers authority, and we've got we operate and maintain the 152 long Friant Kern Canal, which is a big part of my day-to-day life. Not the O&M part, just talking about the canal. I don't actually do that work. Right. I didn't know how to operate a backhoe or anything like that. So we do that, and then we also just represent the water needs of the eastern side of the San Joaquin Valley for the Friant Water contractors. And so the Friant division is about 1.5 million acres, clustered around 99 from about Merced to the Tehachapi's. Mm. So there's a lot of land there. More than 15,000 farms of varying sizes, city of Fresno, city of Lindsay, a few others. So it's a pretty diverse area. I mean, people talk about the San Joaquin Valley, and when they think of agriculture in the valley, they think of driving down 5 and seeing just like rows and rows and rows of orchards, and not a lot of towns except for maybe Kettleman City or something like that. But on the east side of the valley, which is where the Friant division is, that's where all the towns are. Even the people that farm on the west side live on the east side. Mm. So it's a pretty diverse area, and it's a pretty neat project. So, I mean, I can go on for ever and ever about the Friant division and what makes it special, but that's probably not as interesting to folks. And I can get pretty technical quickly. So like reel me back in if I just like go off the ranch.
One part I love kind of driving down the 5 is you see all these signs from farmers, angry about water, like build more dams. You've seen it for like 10, 15 years.
Oh, yeah.
Build more dams. The Congress created water shortage.
Right.
There kind of seems like to be this belief that we have plenty of water.
Right.
We just don't have access to it, or we don't store it properly. Kind of what's the background on that? And is there any truth to this?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a pretty complex issue, like most things. And it's becoming increasingly complex because of things like climate change. Mm. Most of the water system that we built 70, 80 years ago, those facilities, those dams, those canals, all the distribution networks, those were based on hydrology that turns out was actually pretty wet. 100 years ago, it was a wetter period than it is now. And some of that is because of climate change. Some of that is just because of the natural fluctuations in terms of how wet or dry the climate and hydrology is in any given period. So we built these things based on a relatively abundant period of time when we're looking at snowpack and rainfall and how much water is coming down, flowing down from the mountains into all these little reservoirs scattered around the rims of the valley. But that hydrology doesn't really exist now. And so it's true that more storage could be helpful in some years. In other years, it won't be. But I mean, there's something like 1,600 dams in California already. So if someone said this recently to me and it really stuck with me. If you're building a new dam, you're building it in the 1,601st best location. So consider that. Having said that, there are things like dam raises that can be helpful, especially because the hydrology is shifting so that you're getting, in some cases, the same amount of precipitation, but it's not coming necessarily as snow. It might be coming as rain, or the snowmelt may be happening earlier in the year. And so we're seeing more extreme events. So you're having more flood years, and then you're having more dry years. And so more infrastructure like dams can really take sort of temper the volatile nature of year-to-year hydrology changes. But there's not more water available. We're not going to have more water, less water. We may have less water. It's really about being smart with how we're using it. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the big important things that a lot of us have been working on is improving the conveyance, because, in other words, canals and aqueducts and that sort of thing, because even if you have the water available in the reservoirs, you can't use it. You can't even store it underground. You can't do anything like that if you can't actually get it out. And that's becoming increasingly a problem for many of these facilities. I think the other thing that people think about is the regulatory aspect. And I mean, it's a really complex subject, but there are times where we have the ability to potentially take more water when it's available, but there's disagreements, say, through the Delta and pumping water through the Delta. But there are disagreements about when it's a safe time to do that. And even among the scientific community, there are disagreements on some of those issues. And so, the federal government and state government go through these processes to come up with coordinated operations plans for the Delta and for other things. But at the end of the day, politics finds its way into everything. And
Right.
it's hard to get a consensus, even a scientific consensus, on what is the best management plan for making sure that we're protecting sensitive species or threatened species, but we're also maximizing the amount of water that we can move around the state when we can. So it's an issue for sure, but I think it's more complex, obviously, than just build more.
Right.
It's about because building more is not going to make it rain more. There was actually a time where people thought that was true way back in the olden days, but it's not, turns out. So I think that's those signs are, in my mind, they're an expression of grief that you see in the valley,
Right.
because things always seem to get worse and not better. And that's how it's manifesting.
And that's kind of interesting is, what is the status of water in California right now? It seems like we had a drought a couple years ago. We were kind of worried. The Lake Orville was getting super
Right.
low. We saw it on the news all the time. We had some early rain this year, but really,
Yeah.
I guess it was late last year, really
Right.
none this year, right?
Yeah.
But there seems to be no panic. No, you're not seeing on the news. We don't have hey, turn the water off when you brush your teeth. I remember when I was a kid, you'd have commercials and I remember being worried that if I left the water on too long,
oh yeah,
it would kill the fish.
I remember that too.
Yeah.
I grew up in Sacramento like you did. And so
Yeah.
I remember that was the period that was one of the droughts of record. That was late 80s to the early 90s.
Humphrey the Whale.
Turns out this one, yeah, exactly. Turns out this one, Humphrey the Whale, exactly. Turns out this one is a much deeper drought. We thought we were, like you said, we thought we were out of the woods because we had 2017, 2016. Those were okay years. Actually, 2017 was a really good year. But, just a few years later, we're back in this routine again. And I think that's really a reflection of the volatility of what we're seeing in the climate right now. And so we need to be prepared for extended dry periods and also be prepared for these really, really wet periods. I mean, because of the conveyance constriction that we have on the Friant Canal that we're trying to fix, in 2017, we couldn't move 300,000 acre feet of water that would have gone to groundwater storage in the San Joaquin Valley. For use by farmers and communities. And that was a huge disaster because we lost our ability to move it when it was available during a wet year. I think your question about conservation is really what you're asking about. Why was this a crisis? Why did we treat this like a crisis 8 years ago and now nobody's treating it like a
right?
big crisis?
Are we in a crisis?
Are we in a
or
crisis?
Not, I guess, yeah.
Some of the reservoirs and some of the water systems in California right now are doing better than others. The American River system, so Folsom Dam, is pretty normal. I mean,
Really?
if you go up there, it's not low. It's pretty good. Same as the San Joaquin system. The San Joaquin system it's not been a great year, but it hasn't been the worst. And the Sacramento system is the one that's been suffering the most. So that's, Orville and Shasta and things like that. So it's a really uneven year in terms of water throughout the state. And I think but what ultimately is happening is that even though some systems are relatively normal, everybody is still getting less. And I think that's one of the anxieties, again, that you see when you see these signs in the valley and elsewhere, and farmers and others worried about water. When it comes to local conservation and what we can do as people, I think the pandemic has taken a toll, and people for many years have been asked now to do things for other people, and it's hard to be asked to do that again, even if it's something totally different. There's some amount of fatigue of things for the common good. Yeah. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but I think people are just, I don't know. And again, having said that, is my shorter shower going to make a difference? I don't think so. Not on a year-to-year basis, but the mentality of having to do more with less and getting into a conservation and drought extended drought mindset, I think, is important because we are going to be going through this over and over again.
Yeah.
So let's get ready and make small changes on the margins where we can so that we can continue doing something that feels like it's normal. Like this is the status quo and has been the status quo.
Yeah. Last week we had an interesting guest on, we were talking about desal over in kind of the Monterey area and, it just didn't work out. And that seems to be everyone's obvious solution. Like, duh, we have this huge ocean here. Like, let's just take the water from the ocean and bring it to the valley. We'll have more water than we'll ever need. But it seems kind of like nuclear power where it sounds kind of cool, kind of good. But when you dig deep into it, it's just never going to happen.
Yeah.
And I guess there's better alternatives. And so what our guest last week said is recycled water is like so much cheaper, so much easier to do. There's I guess a lot lower hanging fruit that could just totally help us out right now.
I think that's true. I think that there are lower hanging fruit. And I think it depends on whether you're talking about water for people to drink and to use in their homes or water for ag. And those are two separate buckets when you talk about recycled water because there are different standards and water quality standards and human health standards that go to both of those that are required for both of them. So recycled water is a really good idea and it's more feasible in some places than others. And the thing about California water is that it's all very region specific. So what works in one area is not necessarily going to work in other areas. And so when we as a state and as a whole Western region get hit with a drought like this, we all start looking elsewhere and saying, well, what are other people doing? But the reality is not everything is transferable. So what works in some areas for desalination may not be feasible in other areas of the state. And on top of that, desal is really expensive and energy intensive. And like you said, it's a little like nuclear power where, yes, it seems very sustainable, except for what do you do with the waste? And that is a problem as well. That's another impact. That's an environmental impact. And I think people struggle with what to do with the brine that comes out, at the end of the process. Where do you put that? You can't just, can you dump it in the ocean? I don't think you can dump it in the ocean. So what do you do with it?
Right.
And so those are things that there are people who are smarter and more technical than I am that are looking at those, but it's a really, really expensive process. And like you said, there are other things that are lower hanging fruit that we can deal with. And recycling is one thing. Sometimes it's not just another water source. It's how many multi-benefit projects can we implement that are going to be providing sustainability, not just for one set of water users, but for multiple. So in the San Joaquin Valley, obviously we're dealing with implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. A lot of our districts are parts of groundwater sustainability agencies down there. And one of them has been implementing and is planned to implement this, what they call like a strategic recharge project. So they already do a ton of groundwater recharge. They just take the water from the Friant Canal and then they bring it over and put it in a big basin and let it just seep into the ground and save it for later. They're actually looking at doing strategic recharge projects near communities that are dependent on groundwater and already have low quality contaminated water supplies or water supplies that they can't access because the wells don't go deep enough.
Yeah.
And so they're looking at how do I do recharge over here next to this community to improve their water quality and the safety of the water they have to use in their homes while still storing it and potentially using it later. And so there are solutions like that where it's not using water twice, but it kind of is. And so I think those are the sort of solutions that we have to be more comfortable with implementing. But that can take a lot of work among groups that don't always talk to each other about how to implement solutions. And so I think we all have to be pretty flexible about what there's no magic, there's no silver bullet. It's not desal, it's not just recycling. That's a good part of it as well. It's not just landscape conversion or fallowing land or, all those things. It's probably a little bit of all of them where it makes sense to do it. And maybe in certain areas in the coast, San Diego, other places, it makes sense to do desal and probably doesn't in some place like Sacramento. We don't really need that, right? So, but if you have treated water, you can put it, I think Sacramento Regional Sanitation District does this, where they put the treated water and made wildlife habitat with treated water from their wastewater treatment plants. And it also helps with groundwater recharge and everything like that. So It's about doing more with the same amount.
Yeah. It's interesting. She dropped a great term last week, tap to toilet.
Tap to toilet.
Yeah. And she was a big proponent of, making it drinkable.
That's possible. In Orange County and others, I think, have been doing it for a while, where they have done some injection. They've done treated wastewater and injected it into the ground in one part of the basin, then it flows along and they pick it up elsewhere. And it's toilet to tap. That's another possibility. But again, it comes down to who's using the water, and that is part of what dictates whether those solutions are viable to keep people sustainable in an extended drought.
Yeah. I just remember being in high school and college and just reading like Cadillac Desert.
Oh, yeah.
Chinatown, just learning how like LA and Mulholland, stole the Owens Valley River.
There's so many good books about California water.
And it's just so many good stories out there. Right?
And that's, honestly, that was part of why I was drawn to water, is that it's very personal. It's very related to place and people's understanding of where they come from and who they are. And I think you probably feel that a little bit too. I mean, you just mentioned you remember having water conservation and restrictions when in the 80s and 90s. You grew up in Sacramento like I did. So we know that is part of what shaped us. And I think people feel very connected to water, even if they don't realize it, if you grow up in certain areas, or if you have certain formative experiences related to water. And I mean, it drew me in as a policy area because it is something that people feel emotional about, and it's something people care about. And it's a really rich and complex policy area to deal with because it touches everyone. So,
and it, like literally in California, we have these crazy systems in place that, started in the 1920s.
Absolutely. I mean, they are, for all their warts, still among the world's engineering marvels, 100%. But they do, I mean, aging infrastructure is a thing. And the way that a lot of these things were funded back then doesn't necessarily work for funding repairs or expansions or improvements now. And that's something that we've been dealing with to repair the Friant Kern Canal, because we had, like, Friant Kern Canal is federally owned. All the Friant Division contractors who use it pay for repairing it, using it, maintaining it. That's what we do at Friant Water Authority, is do all the O&M and management. But it's a more complex world now with water than it was when the facilities were built. And so back in the day, there was a very clear correlation between who are the beneficiaries of this and who's going to pay for it. And now those roles are muddled and muddied a little bit more than they were back then. The Central Valley Project, which is where the Friant Division lives, was actually planned by the state of California, not the federal government, in the 1920s. And there was a statewide Proposition 7, that was passed by the voters to approve to build it. But then we ran out of money because it was the Depression. And so the federal government took it over. So then the state came along later and built the State Water Project. So we have these two big complementary systems that serve, I don't know, at least 30 million Californians, 32, 33 million. And now those are having some pretty challenging infrastructure issues when it comes to things like subsidence. So subsidence is when the ground elevation sinks because there has been an overpumping of the groundwater and the aquifers below it.
Right.
And so that's been happening. I mean, you can see those photos from 1970 where the guy is standing on with the telephone pole with the markers of where the land used to be in 1925 and 1977. And it's, I mean, some areas have sunk dozens and dozens of feet, but it's accelerated in the last few years. And what happens is that when that land sinks, the facilities sink too, and then there's this effect where you can't actually get enough water down the canal or the aqueduct because it like creates like a bathtub. I mean, you have to reduce the flow so it doesn't overflow, basically. Right. And so you can't move as much water. And that was what we found with the canal, Friant Kern Canal. In 2017, it was a big year again, big water year. And we're running water down the canal at the same rate that we normally would have. And it was hitting the bottoms of these bridges across the canal. And our engineers freaked out a little bit because it shouldn't be doing that.
Right.
And we realized that, after doing some studies, that the canal had sunk about 10 feet in almost as many years, I think. And
Wow.
so, and it was sinking at about a rate of about an inch a month, which is a lot. And so we've begun this process to repair it. The Friant Division was planned as a giant conjunctive use project. And what that means is that everyone or most of the water users off the canal have a lot of capacity to store water underground and then to also use surface water. And so in the really wet years, they take the extra water and they put it underground. And then in the dry years, they use just surface water and then pull some of the water that they'd stored before. And so it's really like it's a huge conjunctive use project. And so when we can't get enough water down the canal, it doesn't operate that way. It doesn't fulfill its functions. And so I think, we have this project. It's going to cost us more than $900 million to fix the entire facility. There are different areas that have subsided more than others. The worst subsidence, the canal has lost 60% of its capacity to move water. And so we're fixing that part. It's called the Middle Reach Capacity Correction Project. And we have assembled a very interesting funding and financing package. It is made up of about $250 million in federal funding and financing. There's money that is coming in as part of a match from the Friant contractors, the people that use the canal. And then we have a couple of settlements with some of the groundwater sustainability agencies in the area that take into account the fact that people who were pumping there were the ones that damaged the canal. So we're going to and then we have this money that came in from the state of California. So since 2019, we've been working to secure some amount of state funding for this project and for a few others. But this one in particular, we had a bill. We have had two SB 559s. There was one in 2019 that was the first one. It was only focused on the Friant Canal. And Senator Melissa Hurtado was the author. And then she had, basically everybody on a very bipartisan basis from the Valley was signed on as co-authors. And that one would have funded up to $400 million or authorized the state to spend up to $400 million to help fix the facility. That one was, I like to joke sometimes that I haven't been involved in running that many bills, but at one point I had two, and I was 2 for 2 on getting them to the governor's desk and 2 for 0 or 0 for 2 on having them actually signed. So that was, I was like, well, at least I got that far, right? So that one, I understand why the governor didn't sign it. The administration has been really great, actually. And they said, look, we've got these big facilities. We have the California Aqueduct. We have the Delta Mendota Canal. We have the Friant Canal. It's like picking between children about like, who do we spend money on? Mm-hmm. And they said, what we really need to do is have a comprehensive approach where we can look at how to improve conveyance at all of those facilities, because they all have the same problem. Right. They are all reduced in their ability to move water around. And that includes the California Aqueduct, which serves Southern California and, almost 30 million people alone just from that facility. So then we ran the second bill, the second SB 559, which I was arguing we should name it another area code in the Valley, but I didn't win that. I didn't win that debate. But it was, that one basically was accompanied with a funding push. And so what the governor did was the administration has put, and the legislature have put $200 million total towards these three facilities over this budget year, last budget year, and this budget year. Uh-huh. So, and we're sharing the coalition of all the water users that was supporting this push. We're splitting the money based on what the original amounts were in the bill that each facility needed proportionally. So that is actually some of the first money that's come in for our project. We broke ground in January, and the state funding was really, really critical. But I have to say, it was kind of a trip for a lot of people because people weren't used to putting state money towards a federal facility because it's still federally owned. Right. And so the question was always like, well, what is the state getting for this? Yeah. What is this doing for the state of California and for the people of California? And, I honestly, I think there are a couple things. So there are two really challenging things we're dealing with in the Valley right now. There's the the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and implementation of that. And then there's the clean drinking water requirements that, there's no reason that 1 million people should be without clean drinking water in California. And a lot of those are clustered in the valley.
Right.
And so there's really, you can't fix that problem without getting more water into the valley too.
Mm-hmm.
Bring more surface water into the valley. So those are state goals and state policies. And I was like, look, if we ever have a hope of meeting those and achieving what the law says we have to do in the valley, we need the support from the state and from the feds, but the state, because these are state policies. I mean, this is how we have to achieve it, right? And so, we got like, it's almost $40 million last year. This year in the new budget that the governor just signed, there's another $40 million for our project, for the Friant Canal. Those are our proportions for that funding. But it's actually a project that's happening. And I think a lot of people at the time when we first began this project, we're thinking like, there's no way you're going to find 500 some odd $1 million to repair this. And like, nope, the state's not going to kick in any money for that. And I was like, why not? I mean, if the locals are putting in money, if the people that cause the problem are putting in money, if the feds are putting in money and loaning money, why shouldn't this be a collaborative solution?
Mm-hmm. That's kind of interesting because, when you worked in the governor's office and around here in the early 2000s or mid, there was no money.
Right, there's no money, right.
And this year we had $100 billion extra.
I know.
And so I always thought, if you had $100 billion extra,
gosh,
you could solve at least one problem in the state that's unsolvable, right?
I feel like I've had that conversation with so many people. Like, if you had $100 billion, you could probably pick off 2 or 3 maybe unsolvable policy issues and just solve them or come really close. Mm-hmm. And even if you don't, you tried. But yeah, I remember we had no money. There was no money available. And that's why we did things like pass bonds, natural resource bonds, infrastructure bonds, which we did for years and years. There's a long history of that. Like I said, Prop 7, that was in, I think, 1927. That was when, or something thereabouts, when the state approved building what would become the Central Valley Project and all this water infrastructure. And so for years we've been, and then in 1960, there was the bond for building the State Water Project. So we have spent a lot of money over the years on ballot propositions to raise money to build things. And now they're in sums that seem paltry compared to the surplus that is available. Right. It's kind of bizarre. And so I think that there's always an opportunity to do more. I think that there's still, I would say that there's an opportunity to do a lot more with that money, especially on the infrastructure side, because these are projects that you can throw money at one time. You're not building in any future requirement or need or ongoing funding stream that's necessary. These are like, throw a lot of money at it. It can be implemented. And then you're under no obligation in the future to continue doing so or continue operating a program or anything like that. So it seems like this is the time that's really ripe for spending on infrastructure. Why pass a $5 billion bond when you have $100 billion in hand that you could use now? Right.
And so help me understand this. You said the canal's at like 60% operational capacity right now. Mm-hmm. So if you fixed it, assuming it could get back to 100%. Mm-hmm. So because does that mean that you could then, I guess, transfer 40% more water or help store 40% more water?
What it really will mean is that it's not necessarily we can just get back 40%, but it means that in years where a lot of water is available, we can move as much as the Friant contractors have the rights to move, and maybe more, depending on, other arrangements and agreements. But it would give us the ability to store more water underground in the wet years so that we can continue using them for those really, really dry periods, which is what this whole canal and dam system was designed to do. Mm. That's how this whole thing was supposed to work, because in the 1920s and 30s, all the land in the valley was sinking already. That was already when the subsidence started. And then the federal government implemented the state of California's ultimate plan for bringing surface water in and stabilizing the groundwater levels. And that's why the whole Friant division was created, was to bring sustainability to the east side of the valley. Well, the system is broken now because we can't move the water the way that it was designed to be moved. So So that's really, I think, the bigger deal is in 2017 years, we will be able to store more water underground and use it when it's available later. And that's something that we, again, have to really get used to doing again, because we're going to be going through these really severe drought periods where we'll have 4 or 5 years of normal to normal dry to very dry to critically dry. We're not going to have an average year anymore. And so the function of this entire system becomes even more important. The original design and function becomes more important. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
I don't know. It's kind of interesting because like everyone who talks water talks acre feet, like this many acre feet, and it's kind of hard to visualize for,
so that was
for
really,
people who don't know.
That was a big shock to me when I moved to North Carolina for graduate school. I said, why does everyone just talk about gallons per minute? Or, and then I realized, wait, okay, everyone's just talking about rates of flow and volumes of flow because they don't need to store a lot. They just take it from the river or from the well. And, it's not like the West. We talk about acre feet because everything about water in the West is related to storing it and capturing it. Well, not everything, but storing and capturing it is a big deal. It's not a big deal on the East Coast. It is a big deal on the West Coast and in the Western US. And so an acre, the metaphor, the analogy that people like to use always is an acre foot is like a football field size. Take a football field and fill it a foot deep with water. And that is an acre foot. And so, I think that the Friant Division has somewhere, and the contracts are for about up to 2.2 million acre feet per year of water in the very wettest, most abundant hydrologic years. But it's been a long time since we've gotten all that. And even if we did have a year where we can't because the canal can't move it anywhere. It can't move it.
So what happens to the water if the canal can't move it?
It ends up being, there's a little bit of carryover, I think, that can happen in the dam, but not that much. Some of it gets released into the river, which again, so we have the San Joaquin River Restoration Program where we've dedicated like 20% of the Friant Division water supply to restore salmon. And we've also paid in hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. And so that is actually working. And so the fish are coming back, but now what we're having an issue with is temperature, because if there's not a lot of water in the dam, you can't maintain cold water pools that salmon need when they spawn. So we are nervous this year that there are going to be fish that have returned and they want to spawn this fall below the dam, but the water is going to, we're hoping it's going to be less than 58, 57 degrees, but it might not be. And
yeah, it seems like you try to solve one problem and then like another.
It is.
It's like whack-a-mole, right?
It really, it sounds so depressing to say that it's a zero-sum game, but in some cases it can be. You're just shifting impacts from one area to another and benefits from one area to another because we live in the West where we have finite resources. So it is a challenge, but I always say to people, don't start working in water unless you know you love it. And if you don't love it, you'll know pretty fast because it can be brutal. It can be a hard place to work. But it's fun. I don't know.
You sold it so well. All those aspirational staffers out there, keep working on water.
I love the people that I get to work for. I've got a board chair who has 60 acres of oranges. People talk about mega farms in the San Joaquin Valley, and there's some really big ones, but not all of them. Like my board chair with his 60 acres of oranges, when I go to my board meetings, he'll bring me a box of oranges and some for my coworkers too. And he'll say, well, will you just pick these? And I shine them all for you myself. Right. So there is still a lot of that. There are a lot of small farms out there. And they're going to have a harder time grappling with future shortages and with the groundwater regulations than the big guys will. And so I think, there's a lot of concern out there right now for smaller farmers who may not be able to pool their risk across multiple farms and really leverage their resources to have the water they need in the future. And maybe they'll throw in the towel, but this is an agricultural region. The valley is. And so it's very much tied to people's culture and what they want to do. Nobody that I work for is, I don't think any of them are farming because they're farming because their family did it, and maybe their grandparents did it or their grandparents did it, and they love it. It's a labor of love. So, and we're fortunate that they do that.
Exactly. We've had Senator Hurtado on a couple of times. We've had Senator Eggman on. We always talk a little water in the Central Valley, and it always seems super convoluted.
It is.
So much different agencies, different, rights. It's a mess, right?
Yeah.
It's a jungle to navigate. Okay, let's play a little fantasy here.
Okay.
I'm going to be elected governor, and I'm appointing you head of DWR. What are the top 3 things you should do, recommend to me, you think that we could do to kind of help, water, help solve water issues in the Central Valley? I
would say that when it comes to the Valley, there is a freight train heading towards the Valley, and that is the cumulative impacts of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and pumping restrictions in the Delta. And DWR doesn't have control over everything in water in California, but they do have roles in most of those issues. And so I would say that we have to be thinking very carefully about how land is retired in the San Joaquin Valley, because we all know that some amount of land will have to be retired. I mean, I've seen estimates that I've been, that I've helped review or read that anywhere from 380,000 to about 900,000 acres over the next 10 to 20 years. And that is, and there are about 5 million acres of land in the valley cultivated. And the valley is also a place where there are many of California's most vulnerable communities that are also working in the agricultural world and the field. And whether you're talking about people who are picking, or people who are farm managers, or people who are running the tractor repair shop or something, the impact to those communities is going to be enormous if 1 million acres of land goes out of production. And they're going to be felt by the people at the top and the people at the middle and the people at the bottom. And there was a study that came out a couple years ago by David Sunding at UC Berkeley, an economic study that looked at the job losses and impacts that are going to be coming from that. And it was something like 45,000 jobs in the San Joaquin Valley will disappear. And then within the state of California as a whole, it was about 80 or 90,000 as a result of 100,000 or 900,000 acres going out of production. That may be easy to absorb in certain areas of the state, but it's not easy to absorb in the valley. Right. And so we need to think very carefully about where we're retiring land and what the impacts on communities are and how we can help mitigate for that. And so, or assist people, because it's not as if you can just pick people up and move them somewhere else and have them do the same work somewhere else. I mean, this is an entirely agricultural economy in the valley. So this is not a water question necessarily, but it's the impact of the policies, the water policies that we've put in place. And so I would say we should be thinking very broadly about what constitutes water and water policy and the sort of assistance that communities will need when those reductions in supply happen. And that is something that I think maybe DWR has a role in, maybe the Water Board has a role in, maybe Food and Ag has a role in, I'm not sure. But there are programs in place to start looking at how to make multi-benefit land repurposing is what they call it. Department of Conservation is involved in that. So let's be thoughtful about where we're doing it, how close we're doing it to communities, how good, how much connectivity we have among parcels that are fallowed, because that ultimately will have to happen. And I think we also need to be thoughtful about the fact that more surface water needs to come into the valley in order to prevent the most pain from happening. And that means through the Delta, that means from the eastern reservoirs, Friant Canal, other places. We need to be able to move as much surface water as we can. It's not just stopping pumping. I think a recognition that more surface water does need to move into the valley in order to achieve the goals that the state has set for sustainable groundwater management, for human right to water and clean drinking water, for making sure that the pain is minimized for vulnerable communities and people who live in some of the poorest counties in the entire state. I mean, I think that would be one thing that I would do, is probably get together with Food and Ag, Conservation, the Water Board, and figure out what is the transition plan that we can put in place. Mm-hmm. Can we think about where it makes sense to fallow land and where it doesn't? Can we think about things that we can do with that fallowed land that minimize the human impact? So I think that's one thing. I think.
Wait, hold up there. Yeah. So you said basically there's 5 million acres in the valley. 5 million
acres. One of them is going to
1 million of them. 1/5.
Yeah.
Why?
Because we will not have enough water. There will not be enough water to support them, so to support production, because there won't be, because we'll have limits on groundwater pumping because of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And then we also have these regulatory limits on how much water we can pull through the Delta. And then we have physical limits on how much water we can get through the Friant Current Canal and other canals. So we're limited on how much surface water we can bring in right now, and we will have to stop using the groundwater. Not all of it, but most of it.
And this is within 10 years, you said?
Yeah, by 2040. So that's going to translate to at least 1 million acres from probably the most realistic study I've seen. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge impact. And I think I don't know if people know this, I know this, but the top 3 ag production counties in the entire United States are Fresno, Tulare, and Kern. And then I think Kings is 4th, maybe.
Might be the entire world, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we export from California 50% of to the rest of the U.S., 50% of the fruits, vegetables, and nuts, more than that. And if we're reducing how much we're growing, I think a lot of people think, well, that production can shift elsewhere, right? It can shift to another state. Probably not so much. It can shift to another country. Mm-hmm. It could shift to, we grow a lot of our nuts and tree fruit and other things in Iran, Turkey, maybe South America in some places, China. There are not that many climates in the world that support the variety of agriculture that we have here in California. And we also have the strongest environmental and labor regulations of any of those places when it comes to production agriculture. I would rather be buying my food here. I don't know what Turkey or Iran or China is doing, but I know what we're doing. And it's done in a way that is protective of the environment and of people for the most part. And so I'd rather have that happen here, but it won't. I mean, we're going to lose 1/5 of irrigated ag. And I think we can still, farmers are very, very resourceful. They can still produce a lot.
Right.
But I mean, there are impacts. We can't ignore the fact that we're shifting impacts from one group to another is really what's happening. And so I would do that. I would also, I think there needs to be a reckoning about the extent to which politics drives some science. And I don't really know how to get around that, but we've started to see this pattern where administrations at the federal and maybe state level to a lesser extent, but certainly the federal level, as political administrations go in and out, the approach to doing some of the scientific work that drives regulations on water in the Delta and elsewhere changes. And it's really hard for us to cut through what is honest about the process and what isn't, and what we really should do. And I don't know that, I'm not sure what the solution is, but depolitization of science related to what helps species thrive, water-dependent species thrive in the Delta and elsewhere, and how to protect them, I think is pretty critical. I mean, there's a lot of independent agencies that could be involved in review of that. There's the Delta Independent Science Board. There are all sorts of like fairly autonomous organizations and agencies that could probably assist with that. And I would leverage them to help us figure out what is the best path forward in a way that is separate from what is a good talking point and soundbite for the people that I think support me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think there needs to be a reckoning about that. And then I of course would pour more money into fixing infrastructure when we have the surplus, right? Again, this is like a one-time thing where we could just go in, throw money at a problem. It doesn't even have to be a lot, but it could be enough to make a really big difference long term.
Right. So like, we've talked about the bonds. I think there was a water bond
There
pass
was.
a couple years ago,
Yeah.
right? And we had the Joe
No,
Biden.
it failed though. It was
failed.
it was Prop 3,
okay.
yeah. So there was actually money in that to fix the Friant Canal and other canals that experienced subsidence in the San Joaquin Valley, and that failed. And
the voters were like, no.
And the voters were like, no, I don't know. But what was really good that came out of that was, so I always feel like the 2018 election was a bummer, but also there were some good bright spots as well. And one of them was that Senator Hurtado was selected in that same election, right? And so she, obviously being from the Valley, she said, I talked about the Friant Canal on my campaign, and it was a real bummer that this proposition failed. And because we actually need that money, we needed that money to fix this problem. And so she was like, I think we should do something about that. And I was like, yes, you should do something about this. You can do something about this. So that was the sort of the nascence for SB 559 and this push to get funding for not just the Friant Canal, but the other major facilities.
How much money, realistically is needed to fix these canals and bring
so to think about what the other, for the Friant Canal to totally fix it and restore capacity through the entire facility is about $925 million. Again, the worst part where it's at 60% pinch point, that is about $500 million. And that's a project we're working on now.
But just like 40 million at a time like that.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it takes longer to get some of the other funding and financing that we've assembled for the package for that. The state is actually fairly agile in its ability to disperse funds. And so DWR and their staff and management and Carla and everyone, they've been amazing in really making sure that this can move quickly, because we were shovel ready. We were like, our environmental compliance is done, our permitting is done, everything is done. Now we just need money to actually give to the contractor to start working. And they made that happen. There's no way we would be as far along as we are right now without having that first 40 million. And it sort of greases the wheels for everything else to come along after that. So yeah, I mean, you could do it in $40 million chunks, but it would be a lot better if we could throw like, I think the California Aqueduct is like $2 billion to fix that one. So, I mean, you could throw $3 billion at these 3 canal projects and get pretty dang far. And it would be cheap. This is like cheap money. It's already there. Right?
Like, kind of like what you just talked about with number 1, with the 1 million acres going away. If you fixed all these canals, would that push that, I
think it would. I mean, what it would do, I think it would minimize the amount of retirement that's needed. So you wouldn't necessarily expand the footprint of ag, but you would probably reduce the fallowing by a certain amount. And we know, at least on the Friant Canal, we have estimates of how much land will have to go out of production just because of the pinch point issue.
Right.
But the reality is all those little communities along in the east side of the San Joaquin Valley, they're all on groundwater. Almost none of them use surface water. And a lot of the little like homes, they've got their own well, they've got their well, right? If water is not being brought in, surface water is not being brought in through the canal, then their groundwater supply is at risk as well. And so that's going to increasingly be a problem. These people who are already suffering from like arsenic and nitrate contamination, and it's just going to get worse if we don't continue to flush it out and put water back in those aquifers that they're relying on. And that's the canal is the way to do that. So that's, I mean, that's a really important aspect of actually implementing this. But yeah, I mean, I would write a check now. Just get it done. Get it done. I mean, there's not substantial opposition to these. I mean, this is not like building a new dam.
Right.
It's relying on the existing stuff. It's just making sure that it can work to the best of its ability, because that's how we build drought resilience.
Right. You know, in every industry, you have like the kind of the future, the technology, kind of, you know, we have electric cars for transportation, we have solar panels and, you know, solar storage. They're talking about wind power. What's the future of water? Is there some, like, I've always heard of technologies like things that create power and water at the same time out of thin air. You know,
I think
is there anything out there
there are some very exciting things that are happening and like farmers, again, are pretty resourceful, and a lot of the irrigation districts are trying out all sorts of neat things. There's some remote sensing, like moisture data that, I mean, a lot of the academic stuff is moving into the application area in ag in particular. And one of them is, remote sensing for moisture content in the soil to figure out where it's, just so you can be very precise. I think this is what it's going to come down to, is technology that helps with the precision of how we use the water efficiently. And so one of the technologies that we've also been involved in supporting, and again, I pushed for a long time to get the state to just take it over. So it's called the Airborne Snow Observatory, and it's a plane mounted with LiDAR equipment, and they do one pass to measure basically the land elevation in a snow-covered and mountainous areas, Sierra Nevada, right? Then every time it snows, or about every month, they take the plane up and they measure the surface elevation with the snow. And then it's real simple math. You just subtract one from the other, and you get a sense of how much snow is available. And they have a whole platform to determine, how much snow water equivalent is there, right? How much snow that will turn into runoff, and when will it happen? And so they can actually do forecasts that are 98% accurate for any given part of a river system or upper watershed, to say, okay, in 2 weeks, we know that X amount of water will be coming down right here, which is amazing because, I mean, imagine if we'd known that. Remember when Oroville had the, spillway issue? Imagine if we'd known 2 weeks in advance that amount of flow was coming down. That would have been incredible. So it's a really precise tool for determining both like water availability in the upper watershed, where you can't get to certain snow measurement sites because it's either in a wilderness area, so you can't drive up there. So you have to like backpack or something, but who's gonna, So what we found is that the state's estimates can be up to 50% off from what they expect to be in the upper watershed versus what actually comes down. And this is 98% accurate. So if we know exactly what's coming down and when it's coming down, we can be a lot smarter with how we use that water once it gets there. And it's for things like flood control. It's super important and a really valuable tool. So the state has been starting to use that as an expanded part of their snow survey program. But it's expensive. So I think, we continue to put money into it. A lot of other water users in the valley, Turlock Irrigation District was actually one of the first ones to pilot this project. But I think that's going to be a really important tool in the future. But it comes down to being more precise with how much water we have. And so the way that most flood operations work now is like there's a set of regulations that are developed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and for any of those dams that have some flood space, it's like, okay, when it gets here, you have to release this much to make space for more runoff coming down so we don't have a flood.
Right.
So evacuate for flood space. But in one instance, a couple years ago, Turlock Irrigation District actually went back to the Corps and said, we're looking at our data from these snow surveys, and there's not enough water in the upper watershed to refill that to the point that you would have a flood risk. So if we release all that water, then we're just losing it. And so they didn't. It saved them like 50 or 60,000 acre feet.
Wow.
So I think that those are the sort of technologies that that will be useful in the future. It's being very, very precise, and not eliminating the guesswork in terms of water management, which is, there's a lot of guesswork. There's a lot of
it's
guesswork.
interesting. We had Marty Ralph on earlier the year talk about atmospheric rivers. And,
Okay.
a lot of this goes back to the 60s. And
Absolutely.
as you said, there's so much science that's come along. Update your policies.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, the atmospheric river and forecast informed reservoir ops and things like that, those are all really important. And we have to become, I think this is one of the takeaways. I mean, we're governed by all these regulations and policies that have been in place for 50, 60, 70 years, and more recently in some cases. But the climate is changing so quickly, and it's such a volatile, in such volatile ways, that we need the tools to be agile and flexible in how we manage water. And not all of the regulations are set up for that. And so instead, we have to find other ways to do that. And so it's either using tools like the atmospheric river forecasting or Airborne Snow Observatory, things like that. But then also using that as a basis to say we can update our regulations and laws to provide that flexibility while still protecting the things that we want to protect. And that's true for things like pumping in the Delta as well. How much more science can we do? What sort of science can we do? What sort of tools can we use that give us more certainty over how we can operate water safely for people and for species?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I first came across on you and your Twitter account in 2020 during the shutdown.
Oh boy.
Very active.
Yeah, I was.
And you wouldn't know at first that you know so much about water, but so you do have a life outside of water.
I do.
Can you kind of tell us about how I guess your attraction to social media and kind of how you use it or operate?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I joined Twitter in like 2009, and I didn't use it for 7 years. It was intimidating to me. I was just like, it's just stimulus coming at me all the time. And it's how do I catch up on everything? How do I go back to see what I've missed? And someone said to me, you don't do that. That's not how it works. You don't try and catch up on what you missed. It's just what's happening right now. And you kind of just have to be comfortable with that. I wasn't a big social media person. I had all the social media accounts and things like that, but I just didn't use them a lot until I had kids. And then everyone wanted to see pictures of kids. So it was like, people always say Facebook is for old people now. So now it's just like how I share a lot of photos with my family and my friends of our children and things like that. I think personally, I don't like, no shade to LinkedIn, but I can't really get that engaged on LinkedIn. It's just, for me, it always felt like really self-promotional in ways that I just am not interested in being or doing.
Right.
I think Twitter is it's my favorite social media platform because it allows, I think the casual nature and informal nature of the platform allows people to be authentic in ways that things like LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or anything else, they don't. LinkedIn, everyone is presenting their best professional self. And on Facebook, it's like, look at my beautiful family. And on Instagram, it's, look at this amazing trip I took to
how much fun I'm having. Yeah.
Malaysia or something, right? And nobody is doing it for any other reason on Twitter than to just, I think, be their pretty authentic selves. And we've seen that for good, for better, for worse, right? We've seen some really bad authentic selves on Twitter, really bad takes, really toxic people. And then there's some where, I think you can find people, you see people's personalities more, and you can find them charming and relatable in ways that you can't on the other social media platforms. I think California Water Twitter is a small but mighty group with a lot of actually very well-connected and well-regarded people in the industry. But we're not a big group, and so it's an easy way to connect with people on a professional and personal level that you may not come across in your professional life necessarily, but you could. And so I actually find it more useful professionally than any of the other ones, for sure. I mean,
oh, definitely. Like, you get up-to-date news, information.
Yeah. Or sharing some random study of something that I saw, and then, someone else pipes up. And I've actually had a couple of professional connections I made with other people on policy issues that grew out of Twitter conversations where it was like someone posted a study on X. And then I said, wait, that's not exactly how it works. Or this is something I've been concerned about. And then you slide into DMs and you find a time to like talk offline. Like it works a lot. But yeah, I do post a lot about my kids. During the pandemic, we lived mostly in Tahoe in the depths of the pandemic. And so Twitter was a nice lifeline and connection to other humans.
Right.
And, sharing pictures of, I don't know, hikes we went on or whatever. And pithy little pop culture things. And I go through periods where I tweet a lot about water and then I just don't for a while. And then right now my account is protected because I got some weird DMs from some people. So it can be a little like, I try to always keep it open and unprotected, but there are times where I go back and forth, but I always accept new followers.
Yeah. Well, so what does a protected account do?
It just means that unless you allow people to follow you, like you can choose who's following you, right? So you protect your tweets so that there have to be follow requests that come in.
Okay.
Yeah. And I had gotten some weird DMs from a few folks and I thought, I'm just going to shut this down for a little bit. Right. So I think right now it's protected, but I don't deny it unless you look like you're a bot. I'm not going to accept follow requests from bots, but
awesome. Well, for those who don't know you, like where how can they I guess follow you and get some info? I highly recommend it. I think it's highly entertaining.
Thank you. I aim to be entertaining. I mean, I know that I probably veer off of I veer into strange territory sometimes on Twitter, but it's me. It's the authentic me, and that's what I like about it. You can follow me at Blonde Alex, and that's blonde with an E. I think on Instagram I'm blonde without the E. Sometimes those names are not available, and the E or the not the
other
E.
Blonde Alexes.
Yeah, there are other blonde Alexes out there. But yeah, so that's me on Twitter, and it's fun, and I try not to get too political. I can get outspoken on water sometimes, and on some other things, geeky things sometimes.
Yeah, the free pictures. Britney Spears.
Free Britney, yes, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yep, that was great. That's great. So,
well, I am thirsty now.
Oh my God,
I need some water. So thank you so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure. Very informative, and
I hope it wasn't too informative. Do you know what I mean?
I think it's helpful because as we've had members on, and it just seems so confusing. It's just kind of like I think what you helped point out was we have different regions, and it's not a one size fit all answer, and every region needs its different answer. And for most of it, the valley is kind of where most people's focus are, but aren't at the same time.
Right, exactly.
So,
so
it's kind of our forgotten stepchild here in California.
It is. So. It feels left behind all the time, the people there.
They do. And they feel that way.
They feel that way. Yeah. That's why you see those signs. So anyway.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.